Good Saturday morning, everyone. Today on Perspectives, we're discussing the political mood of the country with a journalist who has received one of the most distinguished awards for her commentary and insight into politics and cultural issues. Cynthia Tucker, she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated columnist. She's also the current journalist in residence at the University of South Alabama, where she teaches in the English and political science departments. Ms. Tucker has spent most of her career in newspapers, working as a reporter and editor. For 17 years, she served as the editorial page editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, overseeing the newspaper's editorial policies on everything from local elections to foreign affairs. She has also worked as a Washington-based political columnist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as well. Her weekly column, which appears in newspapers around the country, focuses on political and cultural issues, including income inequality, social justice, and reform of the public education system. A native of Monroeville, Alabama, Cynthia Tucker is a graduate of Auburn University, and she was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. Her column was a finalist for the Pulitzer Award in the commentary category in 2004 and 2006, before winning the prestigious honor in 2007. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Ms. Tucker has won countless awards in the field of journalism. In 2006, she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists, the NABJ. And then in 2011, she was inducted into the NABJ's Hall of Fame. Her career has taken her around the world, meeting world-renowned humanitarian and political leaders, such as the late Nelson Mandela. Our discussion today focuses on a historic year in American politics, as well as the dynamics on how this presidential election will shape the future of our nation. We'll also talk about state politics, including Alabama's senatorial election. This year's presidential election created new records at the polling place as voters lined up to let their voice be heard ballot by ballot.
My ancestors, I know what they went through for us to have the right to vote, and to see everyone taking action on that, I like that. That's what I love about it.
All my years of voting, I don't think I have seen this kind of turnout this early, and I hope that it's going to be like this all day long.
I do
and
too.
I'm expecting it to be this way all day long.
Because I know I have never in my heart felt this strongly about getting out to vote.
That's the beauty of democracy. I think people don't understand how important this whole process is. This is what makes us who we are. This is what makes us the envy of the whole world.
Our conversation with Cynthia Tucker on Perspectives up next after this quick break. And joining us now, our guest this morning, Cynthia Tucker, a Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated journalist, as well as incredible career in the business. Thank you so much for being a part of the discussion this morning.
Thank you for having me.
We're talking, of course, about looking back at the election of 2020. Give us first a sort of a takeaway that you had. What was the biggest takeaway from the election?
For me, the biggest takeaway was voter participation. Analysts believe that we have had more voter turnout in this election than we've had in a century. Perhaps as much as 70% of eligible voters participated. And I think that's just an awesome sign for the vigor of our democracy. No matter what else has happened, that is a great sign for the vigor and strength of our democracy.
And looking at what was the motivating factor, some people are saying that it was a vote against the current president, others saying that it was sort of a vote of the times and one of the most important elections in our time.
Well, I think President Trump was definitely the motivating factor here for both sides. He got more votes than any sitting president has ever received. Joe Biden, however, got more votes than any presidential candidate has ever received. So I think on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the political spectrum, there is no doubt that President Trump was a huge motivating factor. Lots of people love him. Lots of people wanted to see him out of office.
When you look at how COVID-19 played into this with both absentee voting, early voting, the mail-in ballot voting, do you think the accessibility and making it easier for some folk had a lot to do with the numbers as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there were many, many voters who were afraid to have to stand in line a long time, especially indoors. And so in many states, election officials made it very easy for people to cast their ballots in unconventional ways. You know, there are some states that have long had mail-in voting. States out west, Oregon is one of those that has had mail-in voting for a long time. Other states went to mail-in voting because of the pandemic. And some states didn't have mail-in voting, but they did unconventional things like set up areas where people could do curbside voting. So you could drive up and essentially toss a mail-in ballot in an approved bin. So there were lots of things that election officials did to make casting a ballot easier and safer for people who were concerned about COVID-19.
Do you think we learned from that to where we'll be doing some things now in the future to make sure that everyone has a different option if necessary to make sure that they participate? And even, you know, I'm still crazy about why we're stuck on this Tuesday, which is an old tradition, but maybe a Saturday day where more people who are off work, and so your participation could be greater.
I certainly think that the ease of voting in this election in many states is here to stay. I encourage that. We want as many people as possible to participate in our democracy. I'm teaching part-time at the University of South Alabama. I teach in English, communications, and political science, and I tell all my students, no matter what class they're in, that voting matters. So I'm one of those who says, let us make it as easy as possible. Let's encourage early voting, especially. Early voting in many states, like Georgia, is held on Saturdays and Sundays, so that people who cannot take off work on Tuesdays can get to the polls easily. But I think we also have to explain to people what's going to happen when we do that. If we have more mail-in voting, that means that some ballots will not be counted until after the official election day. So we have to let people know that we may not know for a while who the winner is.
When you look at the president, you mentioned some of the incredible numbers that he received as the incumbent president. And from one of your columns, I know you outlined several different areas where people were concerned about him, his actions, his character. What do you think accounts for that, for him to get that type of response from the American voter?
Well, you know, we're a deeply polarized country, Eric. We have been trending in this direction for many, many years, unfortunately. Look at the way our Congress works or doesn't work. It is very difficult for Democrats and Republicans to come together and compromise on any issue because the people they represent are so deeply divided. We are very deeply polarized. But I think that there were many people who had sharp disagreements with President Trump. His handling of the coronavirus pandemic is one example of that. There were people around the country disappointed, exasperated, infuriated by the fact that he did not seem to take it seriously. On the other hand, there were many people who thought he had done a great job handling the economy. Before COVID struck, We had some very low unemployment rates. There were people, especially in Rust Belt states, who really liked the way he talked about trade and bringing manufacturing back to the United States. And while there were many people who did not like the rhetoric he used, they thought it was divisive, they thought it was completely unnecessary, they thought it was bullying, there were many other people who liked the rhetoric he used, who thought it was plain spoken. So that just reflects the way that we are so deeply polarized in this country.
Before we take a break here, respond to the turnout for him from black and Hispanic voters. A lot of people surprised that his numbers went up in those two ethnic groups.
Well, first of all, let me say that we really don't know yet how much his vote ticked up among those groups. We do know that Cuban Americans in Florida, South Florida, went heavily for President Trump. But we also know, more surprisingly, that there were Mexican Americans along the Texas border who went for President Trump. However, I don't think we should read too much into that. Latino voters have been voting, a quarter to about 30% of Latino voters have long voted for Republicans. That's especially true for Cuban Americans, who tend to be conservative. It is not yet clear how much more support President Trump drew among black voters. I think he ticked up a point or two. We don't yet know why those voters supported him, but I suspect it had a lot to do with their faith in how he handled the economy.
We're talking this morning with Cynthia Tucker, a Pulitzer Prize-winning syndicated journalist and commentator, as well as an incredible person from Alabama originally. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about the election as well as politics and the future for voters in the state of Alabama. Perspectives continues right after this. We're talking this morning with Cynthia Tucker, and of course talking politics and as well as about the election. How did the response for President Trump work for Tommy Tuberville in the state of Alabama, an incumbent Democratic senator in place who had defeated a Republican just 3 years ago due to some other considerations of character, but yet Tommy Tuberville was able to win overwhelmingly this November. How did that happen in Alabama?
I don't think that's any great surprise. Alabama is an overwhelmingly Republican state. And let's remember that Tommy Tuberville entered the race with great name recognition. I'm an Auburn graduate.
That's right.
So I can appreciate the name recognition that he had. And also, let's remember how very popular President Trump is here. He is so popular that he helped to defeat Jeff Sessions in the Republican primary. Jeff Sessions had been a very popular senator from the state of Alabama, popular and well respected, but when he got to be Attorney General, he and President Trump had some areas of disagreement, contention. President Trump got where he didn't like him very much, and he campaigned against him in the Republican primary, and that knocked Jeff Sessions out. Tommy Tuberville took a clue from that, and he linked himself very closely to President Trump. Now, I think any political analyst could have told you that Doug Jones was vulnerable. I happen to think that Doug Jones was a good senator, but he was a Democrat. And again, Alabama remains a very Republican state. Doug Jones won in an election that had a few things that don't usually turn up. He ran against a weak Republican, a man who was very divisive, who had been credibly accused of sexual impropriety with teenage girls. And so many Alabamians, Republican or not, did not want to support him. So they supported Doug Jones instead. But I think many analysts saw Doug Jones as uniquely vulnerable before this election began.
That's right. A lot of the national people were saying that he would be the one most likely knocked out first from the numbers dealing with Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. Senate. Now, speaking of that and what you mentioned about the Alabama voter being primarily a strong Republican leaning here, do you see a possibility of any future coalitions as of old where you had black votes and white moderates coming together to win elections, like I guess you could say like they did for the Doug Jones election? Do you see that happening again, or is Alabama just a sold-out red state?
You know, I don't see our political polarization changing very much at all over the coming decade. I think we will stay very polarized as a nation, and I think that Alabama will stay overwhelmingly Republican. I think if we're going to look for compromise in Alabama, we should look to the state legislature to see if Democrats and Republicans can come to agreement there on some of the changes that need to be made in our state, such as shoring up public education, shoring up our healthcare system. You know, rural hospitals are closing across the state of Alabama. People fear that the Monroe County Hospital in my hometown of Monroeville may close. Those hospitals are under pressure. So in the state legislature, our leaders need to come together and do something about health care.
When you speak of that, pivot that to Washington, do you think that President-elect Joe Biden will be able to get the people coming to the table and reaching compromise for the betterment of the nation?
I think he has a better shot at it than most people because he spent so many years in the Senate, and he has relationships with senators who are Democrats, senators who are Republicans. He cut deals with Mitch McConnell when he was President Obama's vice president. So I think that President Biden has as good a shot as anyone at being able to bring a little bit of bipartisanship back. But I also think that the voters have to insist on that. Instead of telling our Democratic senators, if you're a Democrat, or our Republican you up there to compromise, to pass legislation for the good of the country. So I think voters have to keep the pressure on in order to ensure that we can have some compromise, and the legislation that we need to get the country moving forward will get passed.
I love you addressing that as we're about to wrap up here. Nan, if you would further elaborate, how does that voter let the representative know, whether it be in the House or the Senate, that this is what we want to happen out here in the hinterlands of America?
That's easy. Write them letters, send them emails, call their phone numbers. They probably won't answer personally, but their staff members will, and their staff members keep track of the hot issues, the things that voters are calling about, that they are emailing about. And when they come home, go to their forums. They usually have town hall meetings. They might be doing it more via Zoom these days, but show up and let them know that you expect them to compromise to bring about the changes that this country needs.
Cynthia Tucker, we thank you so much for spending a little time with us today and sharing your thoughts about the election and the political climate in our nation at this time. And of course, we look forward to having you back as we get a little further in this year coming up, 2021, which will be very interesting, both dealing with COVID-19 as well as the possibly changing nature of some of the things that we expect to happen in Washington. We thank you so much for being a part of this discussion today.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, Cynthia Tucker, Monroeville, Alabama native, syndicated columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and inductee into the Alabama Academy of Honor in 2017. Now, you can read her commentary at cynthiatucker.com, and you can also read her blog there as well. Well, join us here next Saturday morning for Perspectives. We'll see you then. I'm Eric Reynolds. Have a great week.